Have you ever wondered what it felt like to surrender to sleep in a world without clocks or light, where night wasn't a pause but a presence? Imagine winters so long the sky forgot its color, where breath hung in the air like a wandering spirit, and where the boundary between dreaming and waking thinned beneath cold beams of ancient wood. These were the nights of the Vikings. Their longhouses were simple, yet inside people drifted into rest deeper than most of us will ever know. How did they manage such quiet, such certainty, in a world that seemed always on the edge of the unknown? Some said warmth came not only from fire, but from protections whispered against things that moved in the dark. If journeys like this soothe you, feel free to like the video and subscribe to Epic Boring History, so new stories find their way back to you. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what hour has found you, whether you sit in the hush of midnight or at the edge of morning. Now dim the room around you, breathe a little slower, and step with me through a longhouse door where embers flicker like watchful eyes. Tonight, we follow the quiet rhythm of Viking nights. We trace the footsteps of a woman who once crossed misted seas, and we listen for the old beliefs, soft warnings and gentle superstitions, still whispering somewhere in the dark. You wake in darkness, though whether it is late night or early morning you cannot immediately tell. The quality of shadow inside the longhouse offers few clues during these winter months, when the sun barely crests the horizon before sliding away again. Around you, the structure breathes with life, low sounds of shifting bodies, the soft exhale of livestock penned at the far end of the long rectangular space, the settling of embers in the central hearth that runs like a glowing spine down the middle of the earthen floor. Your eyes adjust slowly to the dimness. Smoke hangs in the upper reaches of the longhouse, thick and grey, drifting toward the small gaps in the roof where it eventually escapes into the frozen air outside. Every breath tastes of it: wood smoke, peat smoke, the acrid edge of burning animal fat from yesterday's tallow lamp. Your throat is perpetually dry upon waking, your tongue slightly coated, your lungs accustomed but never quite comfortable with this constant companion of indoor life. The bedding beneath you is a straw-filled mattress, flattened from weeks of use, covered with whatever furs and woven wool blankets your household could gather. The straw pokes through the fabric in places, scratching at your skin, and you've long since learned to shift your weight unconsciously through the night to avoid the worst of the lumps. Beside you, your spouse's warmth mingles with your own beneath the shared coverings, and beyond them, children sleep in a small huddle, their breathing soft and rhythmic. You cannot remember a night of sleeping entirely alone. The concept itself seems strange, almost frightening, to be separated from the warmth and presence of others in a world where cold is the great enemy and isolation the harbinger of death. Even now, as you lie in this half-waking state, you can hear the household around you. Someone coughing quietly in the darkness, the shuffle of a dog moving closer to the dying hearth, the small sounds of digestion and breath that mark the presence of cattle and goats in their section of the longhouse. Privacy is a luxury unknown to you, a concept that would seem peculiar if someone from a distant future tried to explain it. Your entire life unfolds in the presence of others: birth, illness, lovemaking, argument, prayer, death. The longhouse is the world contained, and its wooden walls are all that stand between your family and the vast, indifferent cold of a Scandinavian winter. The structure itself is a marvel of communal engineering, though you've never thought of it that way. Curved timber frames rise from the earth, supporting walls of upright planks and a roof thatched with turf and bark. The whole thing settles and shifts with the seasons, wood expanding in summer moisture and contracting in winter's grip, so that the longhouse seems almost alive, creaking and groaning like a great beached ship. Wind finds its way through gaps in the planking, bringing with it the smell of snow and pine, a sharp cold that makes you burrow deeper into the furs. Outside, the world is locked in winter's hold. Snow lies deep across the fields, transforming familiar landscapes into strange white plains, broken only by dark stands of forest and the grey stone of distant mountains. The fjord, if you live near the coast, is a sheet of dark water, not yet frozen, but cold enough that standing near it steals the warmth from your bones. If you live inland, the rivers might be locked solid, great highways of ice that will remain until spring's arrival brings the first crack and groan of breakup. These are the months when daylight is precious and brief. The sun, when it appears at all, traces a low arc across the southern sky, offering light but little warmth. Shadows stretch long even at midday, and the world exists in perpetual twilight, a blue-grey luminescence that never quite brightens into day and never quite darkens into proper night. Your body, like the bodies of all who live this far north, has learned to cope with this strange rhythm, though it never feels entirely natural. Sleep during these months is both easier and harder. Easier because the darkness seems to invite rest, because there is less work to be done when fields are frozen and boats pulled up on shore, because the cold itself makes you want to burrow into warmth and stillness. Harder because the long nights can stretch endlessly, because bodies accustomed to labor grow restless with enforced stillness, because the darkness sometimes feels like it might never end. But now, in summer, summer is a different kind of challenge entirely. The sun barely sets, hovering just below the horizon before rising again, flooding the world with pale gold light at hours that should belong to darkness. Sleep becomes elusive when brightness presses against your closed eyelids, when birds sing at midnight, when the very air seems to vibrate with wakefulness. The Longhouse has no shutters, no way to block out this relentless illumination, so you and your family simply adapt, sleeping when exhaustion demands it, regardless of whether the sky is light or dark. You rise now as you must, because the day's work begins regardless of how rested you feel. Your joints protest, they always do upon waking, a chorus of small aches that are the legacy of a life lived in constant physical labor. Your hands, when you look at them in the dim firelight, are rough and calloused, scarred from 1,000 small cuts and burns, the nails broken and rimmed with dirt that never quite washes clean. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing those still sleeping, you make your way to the hearth. The fire has burned down to a bed of coals during the night, and your first task is to coax it back to life. You add small sticks, blowing gently, watching as tiny flames lick upward. Fire is life in this cold place. It cooks food, provides warmth, offers light in the darkness, keeps predators at bay. Letting it die completely would be a grave failure, so someone must always tend it, banking the coals at night and reviving them each morning. As the fire grows, others begin to stir. The household wakes in stages, a slow emergence from sleep rather than any sudden transition. Children blink awake, stumble toward the warmth, their hair wild from sleep. Your spouse rises, begins the morning tasks, checking food stores, setting water to warm, preparing the day's first meal. This is the rhythm of your days, unchanging and unending, as reliable as the seasons themselves. The work that awaits you is physical and unrelenting. If you are a man, you might spend today hauling timber from the forest, the heavy logs leaving your shoulders aching and your hands raw. Or perhaps you'll be fishing, standing for hours in a small boat, the cold spray soaking through your wool clothing, your fingers growing numb as you pull in nets. Or working on the farm, tending animals, repairing fences, cutting peat for fuel, the labor so constant that your body moves almost without conscious thought. If you are a woman, your day will be no less demanding. There is wool to card and spin, the steady rhythm of the spindle a constant companion. Cloth to weave on the upright loom that stands against the longhouse wall, your arms reaching up and pulling down in motions repeated thousands of times until your shoulders burn. Butter to churn, milk to process, herbs to dry, food to prepare over the smoky fire, and always, always children to tend, feeding them, teaching them, keeping them safe from the 100 dangers that lurk in a world without modern protections. The diet you subsist on is plain and often monotonous. Salted fish forms the backbone of many meals, preserved from the summer catch and stored in barrels. Barley porridge, thick and filling, serves as another staple, sometimes enriched with a bit of milk or the rare addition of honey. Root vegetables when available, turnips, onions, their earthy taste a welcome variation. Occasional cheese, hard and sharp. Meat when an animal can be spared, or game when hunting is successful, but never in the abundance that later ages will take for granted. This diet affects your sleep in ways you don't consciously recognize. The heavy salt content leaves you perpetually thirsty, waking sometimes in the night to drink water from a wooden cup. The barley, while filling, can sit heavily in your stomach, causing discomfort as you lie down. The lack of variety means your body is often deficient in certain nutrients, leading to a general low-level unwellness that you simply accept as the normal state of human existence. By midday, if it is winter, the brief period of twilight that passes for daylight is already beginning to fade. You've been working for hours, your body moving through practiced motions, your mind often wandering to other thoughts. There is no clock to mark the hours, no schedule beyond the natural rhythms of light and darkness, hunger and satiety, exhaustion and rest. Social hierarchy shapes every aspect of your life, including where and how you sleep. If you are among the more fortunate, a landowner perhaps, or skilled in a valuable trade, your section of the longhouse might be slightly more spacious, your furs a bit thicker, your portion of food marginally larger, but even the wealthiest farmer is not so far removed from the poorest laborer. You all share the same smoke, the same cold, the same essential struggles against a harsh environment. The family is everything in this world. Your place in the social web is defined by kinship, who your father was, who your brothers are, what family your spouse came from. These ties bring both support and obligation. If your cousin's farm fails, you're expected to help. If your brother calls for aid, you must answer. But likewise, when trouble finds you, these same networks of kinship provide the only safety net you'll ever know. Children are precious but not coddled. They're expected to contribute to the household work as soon as they're able, learning through observation and participation. A 5-year-old might help feed chickens, an 8-year-old begin learning to spin wool, a 12-year-old be trusted with increasingly complex tasks. This early immersion in adult responsibility means childhood is brief, but it also means that by the time young people reach maturity, they possess the skills necessary for survival. Marriage is practical as much as romantic. Alliances between families, the joining of resources, the continuation of bloodlines, these considerations shape which unions are made. But this doesn't mean affection is absent. In the close quarters of the longhouse, where lives are lived in constant proximity, genuine fondness often grows between spouses. You see your partner in all states, exhausted, ill, frightened, joyful, and through this complete knowing, a kind of intimacy emerges that perhaps runs deeper than passion alone. As evening approaches, the quality of activity shifts. The most demanding physical labor is complete and attention turns to the maintenance tasks that keep a household functioning. Tools need repair, a broken axe handle must be replaced, a torn net mended, a knife sharpened on a whetstone with long, patient strokes. Women continue their textile work by firelight, the spindle turning, fingers moving with practiced efficiency, even in the dimness. This is also the time for stories. The oral tradition is strong in your culture. Tales of gods and heroes, accounts of ancestors' deeds, sagas that blend history and legend until the boundary between them becomes impossible to discern. An older member of the household might begin speaking, voice rising and falling in practiced rhythms, and everyone pauses in their work to listen. These stories serve many purposes. They entertain during long, dark evenings, they transmit cultural values, they preserve history, and importantly, they create a shared world of meaning that binds the community together. The gods are ever present in your understanding of the world. Thor with his hammer, protecting mankind from giants and chaos. Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom and war and poetry, who gave one eye for knowledge. Freya of love and fertility, whose favor might mean good crops and healthy children. These are not distant, abstract deities, but intimate presences who take interest in human affairs. You make small offerings, a portion of food left out, a prayer whispered before a journey, an amulet worn for protection. As the household prepares for sleep, a series of small rituals unfolds. Someone must secure the door, a simple wooden barrier that nonetheless represents the boundary between the ordered world of the Longhouse and the wild darkness beyond. The fire must be carefully banked, enough fuel to keep coals alive through the night, but not so much that it becomes a danger. Someone checks on the animals, ensuring they're settled, for a restless cow might kick and cause injury or damage in the darkness. You arrange your bedding, shaking out the straw to redistribute it more evenly, pulling the furs up to where they'll be readily accessible. The sleeping platform, really just a raised section of floor along the Longhouse wall, is shared by your immediate family. There is barely enough room for everyone, so you sleep close, bodies touching, breath mingling. In winter, this closeness is survival. Shared body heat might make the difference between waking and not waking when the temperature drops. Around your neck, you wear an amulet, a small hammer of Thor carved from bone. It has been blessed by a godi, a chieftain priest who knows the proper words and rituals. You do not think of this amulet as magical in the way a later age might understand magic, but rather as a link to divine protection, a physical reminder that you are not entirely alone in the darkness. Before lying down, you touch it briefly, a gesture so habitual you barely register it, a small prayer for safe sleep and good dreams. The children settle down first, their young bodies quick to succumb to exhaustion after a day of activity. They curl together like a litter of puppies, small hands clutching at fur, their faces peaceful in the firelight. You watch them for a moment, feeling the complex mixture of emotions that parenthood brings. Love, certainly, but also a kind of fierce, protective anxiety, for you know how fragile life is, how quickly illness or accident can steal away the young. Your spouse settles beside you and you exchange a few quiet words, thoughts about tomorrow's tasks, a small worry about dwindling food stores, a moment of shared humor about something one of the children said. These brief conversations are intimate not because of their content, but because of their context. The day's armor removed, voices soft in the darkness, the rare moment when you're not actively working, but simply being together. Other members of the household are finding their sleeping places as well. Perhaps an elderly parent, moving more slowly now, bones protesting each shift of position. Maybe a thrall, a slave, captured in a raid or born into servitude, whose sleeping place is less comfortable, closer to the door where cold drafts are strongest. The household is a complex social unit containing multiple generations and various degrees of status, all compressed into this single, shared space. As you lie down, your body begins its nightly catalogue of aches. Your lower back is particularly troublesome tonight. Perhaps you lifted wrong while moving logs. Your left shoulder, injured years ago and never quite the same, sends small shooting pains when you shift position. Your hands, throb dully, the constant use wearing away at joints that have no rest and no medical care beyond poultices of herbs whose efficacy is more hope than science. The sounds of the Longhouse settling for night create a kind of symphony. Snores begin almost immediately. Not just human snores, but the snuffling sleep sounds of animals. A dog whimpers softly, chasing something in dreams. The goats shift in their pen, hooves scraping on earth. The fire hisses and pops as sap in the wood heats and expands. The wind outside finds gaps in the walls, making the structure creak like a ship at anchor. Sleep does not come instantly for you. Your mind, given rare leisure from the demands of physical labor, begins to turn over thoughts, worries mostly, practical concerns about whether the food stores will last until spring, whether that brewing storm you smelled on the air will bring damage, whether the tensions between your family and a neighboring household might escalate into something dangerous. These are not idle fears, but constant companions in a world where survival margins are thin. Sometimes your thoughts turn to larger questions, the kind of wondering that emerges in the space between waking and sleeping. What do the gods truly want from humans? Where do people go when they die? Is it really the great halls of the afterlife that the stories describe, or something else entirely? Why does the world contain both great beauty and great cruelty? These questions have no answers, but asking them seems to be part of what makes humans human. Memory visits you often in these drowsy moments. You remember your childhood, already decades past, though you're only in your 30s, a long life by the standards of your time and place. Images surface, your mother's hands carding wool, the particular smell of bread baking, the terror and excitement of your first time on a boat. You remember people who are gone now, taken by disease, by injury, by the simple wearing away that age brings. They feel close in the darkness, almost present, as if the boundary between the living and the dead grows thin in the night. The darkness itself has a quality unlike anything later ages will know. There are no streetlights, no neighbor's window glowing with electric brightness, no distant city glow staining the sky. When the fire burns low and clouds cover the stars, the darkness is absolute, a thick, pressing presence that can be disorienting, even frightening. You've grown accustomed to it, but it never becomes entirely comfortable, this blackness in which anything might exist unseen, and things do exist in the darkness, or so everyone believes. Spirits of the land, Landvettir, who must be appeased lest they cause mischief or harm. The dead who have not gone peacefully to their rest, who might walk if rituals were not properly observed. Strange creatures from the old stories, trolls and elves, who exist in that uncertain territory between myth and experience. You are not superstitious. Superstition implies false belief, but rather, you live in a world where the supernatural is simply natural, where the seen and unseen interpenetrate seamlessly. Fear is a companion in the night, but not overwhelming fear. It's more a watchfulness, an awareness that the world contains dangers you cannot fully control or predict. A raid might come in darkness, hostile neighbors or foreign raiders, seeking to steal food, animals, valuables, even people. Wild animals still roam these lands, bears and wolves, both dangerous under the right circumstances. And always, the cold itself remains the most relentless predator, waiting for any mistake that might give it entry. But you have defenses against fear, the presence of family all around you, their breathing and warmth, a constant reassurance. The walls of the Longhouse, solid and strong, built with skill and maintained with care. The weapons within reach, your axe, used for wood during the day but ready for defense if needed, resting against the wall near your sleeping place. The rituals and prayers that create a sense of order, of human will imposed upon chaos. As your body temperature drops slightly in the transition towards sleep, you pull the furs higher, tucking them around your chin. The wool blankets beneath the fur have absorbed the smoke smell so thoroughly that you notice it only when you've been away. After a day working outside in clean air, returning to bed at night, you catch the scent again, strong and acrid. But it is also familiar, even comforting in its way, the smell of home and safety. Your breathing begins to slow and deepen. The thoughts that were tumbling through your mind grow less coherent, more dreamlike. An image surfaces, the fjord at sunrise, the water like glass, mountains reflected perfectly. Then another, your father's face, long dead, but suddenly vivid. Then something that makes no sense, a fragment of dream beginning to weave itself while you're still partly conscious. The transition into true sleep is gradual, unmarked by any clear boundary. You don't notice when the sounds of the Longhouse become incorporated into dreams, when the ache in your back becomes a memory of climbing a steep hill, when the warmth of the furs transforms into summer sunshine. You slip from one state into another as naturally as a boat drifting from shore, borne away on currents you don't control and don't resist. Your sleep, when it fully claims you, is profound. This is not the light, fitful sleep of someone who lives in comfort and security, whose greatest nighttime challenge is finding the right temperature under a down comforter. Your sleep is the deep unconsciousness of true exhaustion, the body's absolute demand for rest and restoration after hours of unrelenting physical labor. The cold itself, paradoxically, contributes to the depth of your sleep. As your body temperature drops slightly in response to the cooling air, the fire is just embers now, offering minimal heat, your metabolism slows. Heart rate decreases, breathing becomes shallow and even, brain activity shifts into patterns that facilitate the deepest stages of rest. The thick layering of furs and wool creates a microclimate around your body, a pocket of warmth that your system works to maintain, a gentle ongoing task that actually promotes sleep rather than disrupting it. The physical exhaustion is real and total. Every muscle group has been used today. Legs from walking and standing, back from lifting and bending, arms from hauling and carrying, hands from gripping tools and working materials. This wholesale tiredness creates a kind of pleasant heaviness, a sensation of your body sinking into the bedding, becoming part of it. There's no energy left for restlessness, no reserve for tossing and turning. You sleep as the dead are said to sleep, motionless and deep. But there's more to it than just exhaustion and cold. The social closeness plays a crucial role, though you'd never articulate it in these terms. The presence of family members all around, their familiar sounds and smells, creates a psychological sense of safety that allows truly deep rest. You are not alone against the world. You are embedded in a protective web of kinship. Some ancient part of your brain, the part that evolved on African savannas when humans first became human, recognizes this configuration and signals safety, permission to truly let go into unconsciousness. The rhythm of days, unchanging and predictable, also contributes. Your body knows what to expect. Hard work followed by rest, activity followed by stillness. There's no decision fatigue, no lying awake, wondering what you should do tomorrow, because tomorrow will be essentially the same as today. This certainty, while it might seem limiting, actually creates a kind of peace. You know your role, your place, your duties. In the darkness, you can release all of that and simply be. Dreams come, as they always do, though you won't remember most of them upon waking. Some are mundane, replays of the day's work, your mind processing and organizing the experiences of waking life. Others are strange and symbolic, the kind of vivid imagery that seems meaningful while you sleep, but dissolves like mist in the morning light. And occasionally, very occasionally, there are dreams that feel different, laden with portent, colored by something that seems to come from outside yourself rather than within. These latter dreams you will remember and share because in your culture dreams can be significant messages from gods or ancestors or the hidden parts of the world. A dream of ravens might be a sign from Odin. A dream of ships might foretell a journey or a raid. A dream of death might be a warning or simply a reflection of the ever-present reality that life is fragile and brief. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, you shift position unconsciously, your body seeking to redistribute pressure, to ease an ache, to find a slightly better configuration. You might half wake for a moment, aware of the cold air on your face, the warmth of the furs, the soft sounds of the household. Then sleep reclaims you, pulling you back down into darkness more complete than the darkness around you. Others in the Longhouse are also sleeping their own sleeps. A child dreams of playing near the river. Your spouse dreams of nothing, floating in blank unconsciousness. The elderly parent dreams of youth, reliving memories from decades past with strange clarity. Even the animals sleep, their own simple dreams, consisting of sensations and instincts rather than narratives. The night deepens. Outside, stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, the same stars that guided your ancestors across seas, the same stars that will guide your descendants into futures you cannot imagine. Snow might be falling, soft flakes accumulating in silence. Or the aurora might be dancing, sheets of green and blue light rippling across the northern sky, a phenomenon you've seen countless times but never stopped finding beautiful and slightly uncanny. Inside the Longhouse, time moves differently. There are no hours, no minutes, just the slow progression from evening to night to the first hints of morning. The fire dies down further, barely glowing now, and the temperature drops accordingly. But this too is familiar, expected, and your sleeping body adjusts without waking, pulling the furs tighter, shifting closer to the warmth of others. In the margins between sleep and waking, in those liminal moments that might come at any point during the night, you exist in a state that later ages will largely lose, a kind of conscious dreaming where you're aware of lying in bed, but also experiencing vivid mental imagery, thoughts that flow with dreamlike logic but haven't entirely severed connection with waking awareness. In these moments, the line between inner and outer reality grows permeable. A thought becomes a sensation, becomes a memory, becomes a vision, all flowing together without clear boundaries. This is when the world feels most mysterious, most full of hidden meaning. The gods seem closer in these moments, as if consciousness itself is a kind of threshold where human and divine can meet. You might offer a wordless prayer, not asking for anything specific, but simply acknowledging the presence of forces larger than yourself. Or you might think of the dead, wondering if they somehow still exist, if some part of them lingers in the world you know. The quality of rest you experience is something most of your descendants will never know. It's not that your sleep is free from disturbance, a crying child, a coughing family member, an animal making noise, your own bodily needs pulling you toward wakefulness. But when you do wake briefly, there's no anxiety about it, no desperate attempt to reclaim sleep, no lying awake for hours, worrying. You wake, address whatever needs addressing, then slip back into sleep as easily as diving into water. This is partly cultural. You have no concept that sleep should be one continuous uninterrupted block, so you don't feel distressed by fragmentation. But it's also biological. The sheer depth of your exhaustion means your body is always ready to return to sleep, always capable of finding that unconscious state again within moments. Sleep is not something you have to chase or struggle for. It's simply what your body does when given the opportunity. The muscles of your jaw are slightly relaxed in sleep, your mouth perhaps falling open, your breathing creating soft sounds that blend with all the other sounds of the household. Your hands, finally still after their day of constant motion, rest on the furs, fingers occasionally twitching as dreams send phantom commands to move, to grip, to work. Your heart beats slow and steady, its rhythm stable and peaceful, the pulse of life continuing through the darkness. Blood flows through your body, delivering oxygen, removing waste, performing the 10,000 tasks of cellular maintenance that never cease as long as life persists. Your digestive system processes the evening meal, breaking down the salted fish and barley porridge into components your body can use. Your immune system patrols for threats, fighting low-level infections and injuries you're not even aware of. All of this happens in sleep, the body's opportunity to repair and maintain itself. Your brain, too, is busy in ways you could never consciously perceive. Memories are being consolidated, important experiences tagged for long-term storage, while trivial details are allowed to fade. Neural connections are being pruned or strengthened based on the day's learning. Cellular waste products are being cleared away through channels that open more fully during sleep. The organ of consciousness is performing essential maintenance, preparing itself for another day of guiding your body through the world's demands. As the night moves toward morning, though morning in winter is barely distinguishable from night, your sleep begins to lighten slightly, moving from the deepest stages back toward something closer to waking. Dreams become more vivid, more narrative, your mind preparing for consciousness by warming up its story-making machinery. You might have a brief moment of confusion upon partially waking, forgetting for an instant where or when you are, before familiar sensations orient you. The smoke smell, the sound of breathing, the weight of furs, the ache in your back. But you don't wake yet. It's still too early, still too dark, still too cold. So you burrow back into warmth, into the pocket of security you've created, and let sleep reclaim you one more time. This is the sweetest sleep, this early morning rest, because some part of you knows that waking is inevitable, that the day and its demands are approaching, and these final moments of unconsciousness feel precious precisely because they're fleeting. And so you rest, despite the cold that presses against the Longhouse walls, despite the smoke that has infiltrated every fiber of your being, despite the hunger that is never entirely satisfied and the pain that is your constant companion. Despite all the hardships that make your life objectively difficult in ways that later ages would find intolerable, you sleep deeply and well, because sleep is not about comfort, not primarily. Sleep is about safety and exhaustion and surrender. It's about a body so thoroughly tired that it has no choice but to rest. It's about the trust that comes from being surrounded by kin, the trust that says, you can lower your guard because others are part of your circle of awareness. It's about the simplicity of a life that, while hard, is also clear in its demands and expectations. In the modern world, people will toss and turn in climate-controlled bedrooms, their bodies comfortable, but their minds racing with anxieties about work and relationships and the 1,000 decisions that contemporary life demands. They will lie awake for hours despite being physically secure and materially comfortable, because comfort alone does not guarantee rest. But you, in your smoky longhouse on the edge of a frozen fjord, sink into sleep as naturally as stones sinking into water. The very hardships that make your waking life difficult conspire to make your sleep profound. The cold demands rest to conserve energy. The exhaustion eliminates restlessness. The proximity to family satisfies ancient needs for security. The absence of choices creates mental peace. This is the paradox at the heart of Viking sleep, that the harsh world they inhabited actually facilitated the deep rest that modern comfort often fails to provide. They slept not despite the difficulty of their lives, but, in a strange way, because of it. She was born into the same world we've just inhabited, a world of smoke and cold and unending labor. The child who would become Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir entered life in Iceland sometime near the year 980 in a longhouse not unlike the one we've described to parents whose names are preserved in saga, but whose daily existence was likely indistinguishable from the common experience. Her mother held her in the dim firelight, wrapped her in the same rough wool, laid her to sleep in the same scratchy straw bedding that every Icelandic infant knew. But Gudrid's life, though it began ordinarily, would unfold into something remarkable, not because of wealth or power, but because of the sheer scope of her travels and the quiet endurance she would display across decades of change. Her story allows us to trace how sleep itself might have evolved through different circumstances: childhood in Iceland, marriage and loss in Greenland, pregnancy in Vinland, and finally return and old age back in Iceland. Through her nights, we can understand how the Vikings carried their rest with them across vast distances. As a small child, Gudrid would have slept as all Viking children slept, piled together with siblings or cousins, their small bodies generating shared warmth in the cold nights. She would have known the sensation of waking, to find an arm thrown across her face, a foot pressed into her ribs, the tangle of family closeness that was the only way children survived the winters. The sounds of the Longhouse would have been her lullaby. Her mother at the loom long after the children were put to bed, the soft words of parents speaking privately in the darkness, the creak and shift of the building settling. Her childhood nights would have been filled with the stories that shaped her world. Someone, perhaps her father, perhaps her grandmother, would have told the old tales as darkness gathered. Stories of the settlement of Iceland, just a few generations past, when her ancestors had come from Norway seeking land and freedom. Stories of the gods walking among men in ancient days. Stories of heroes whose names were already becoming legendary, their deeds growing larger with each retelling. These stories would have populated her dreams. In sleep, the child Gudrid might have imagined she saw Thor's hammer crashing down on giants, or Odin riding his eight-legged horse across storm clouds. She might have dreamed of her grandfather, dead before she was born, yet vivid in the stories her father told. Dreams and stories and waking reality existed in closer proximity in that world. The boundaries between them, more porous than later ages, would find comfortable. As she grew older, her days filled with more responsibility, and her sleep began to carry the weight of labor. By age 10 or 11, she would have been spinning wool daily, her young fingers learning the rhythm, her back beginning to ache from the posture the work required. By her teens, she was fully integrated into the household's economy, her contributions essential rather than supplementary. And with this labor came the familiar exhaustion that made sleep deep and immediate. The saga sources, written down generations after the events they describe, mixing history with storytelling, tell us that Gudrid was considered attractive and accomplished, someone who carried herself well and possessed the skills valued in women of her time. But the sagas can't tell us about the nights of her young womanhood, the times she might have lain awake, thinking about her future, wondering who she would marry, what kind of life awaited her. These internal experiences leave no historical record. What we know is that her father, Thorbjorn, decided to leave Iceland when Gudrid was a young woman. The decision would have been discussed in the household, debated in those evening hours when work was done, but sleep had not yet claimed everyone. Iceland was becoming crowded, good land increasingly scarce, and opportunities seemed to lie westward, in Greenland, where Eric the Red had established settlements a generation earlier. The preparation for such a journey would have occupied months. Goods had to be gathered, animals selected, arrangements made with those who would sail with them. And through all of this, Gudrid would have lain awake some nights, excited and terrified in equal measure, imagining a future she could not clearly envision. The last nights in her childhood home must have carried a particular quality, a consciousness that each sleep there was numbered, that soon she would close her eyes in a completely different place. The voyage itself transformed sleep into something strange and difficult. On the ship that carried them westward across the North Atlantic, there was no proper place to rest. You lay where you could, wedged between cargo and other passengers, the vessel pitching and rolling with every wave. Sleep came in snatches, brief periods of unconsciousness, snatched between bouts of seasickness and the constant wet cold of ocean spray. The nights at sea would have been unlike anything Gudrid had experienced before. The darkness was absolute when clouds covered the stars, a moving, living darkness that seemed to breathe with the waves. The sounds were all wrong. Instead of the familiar creaks of a longhouse, there was the groan of ship timbers under stress, the slap of waves against the hull, the cry of seabirds following the vessel, and beneath it all, the constant awareness of the black water just beyond the planks, deep and cold enough to kill in moments. But humans are adaptable, and after days at sea, even this became almost normal. Gudrid would have learned to sleep despite the motion, her body finding equilibrium with the ship's movement. She would have learned to ignore the constant damp, the salt crusting her hair and clothes, the intimate closeness of too many people in too small a space. The exhaustion of fear and discomfort would have brought its own form of rest. When they finally reached Greenland, misnamed by Eric, for it was as harsh as Iceland, perhaps harsher, Gudrid entered a new phase of her life. The settlement at Brattahlid, where Eric and his family lived, was the heart of the Norse presence in Greenland. Here, Gudrid would have slept in a longhouse once more, but not her own family's longhouse. She was a guest, a newcomer, her position uncertain and dependent on the hospitality of others. It was in Greenland that she married for the first time. The saga names her husband as Thorir, a Norwegian who had come to Greenland seeking opportunity. Their marriage would have followed the usual patterns, practical considerations mixed with whatever personal attraction existed between them. And their nights together would have been the usual shared experience of Viking married life, closeness in darkness, quiet conversations, the slow building of intimacy that comes from repeated proximity. But Thorir became ill. The sagas mention this briefly, without detail, as they mention so many deaths, a sentence or two, then moving on. But for Gudrid, his illness would have transformed her nights into vigils. She would have lain beside him as his health failed, listening to his labored breathing, feeling the heat of fever radiating from his body, knowing that death was approaching and being powerless to prevent it. The nights of illness are their own particular torment, the sleeplessness of worry, the half-sleeping state where you jerk awake at every change in the sick person's breathing, the exhaustion that leaves you hollow but unable to truly rest. When Thorir finally died, Gudrid was left a widow in a land far from her birth, her future suddenly uncertain again. The grief of loss has its own quality of sleeplessness. In the nights after Thorir's death, Gudrid would have lain in the darkness, acutely aware of the empty space beside her, the absence of his warmth and breath and presence. She would have found herself listening for sounds he would no longer make, reaching in sleep towards someone no longer there. This is the cruelty of habit. The body learns to expect certain patterns and feels their absence as a physical ache. But life continued because it always does. Gudrid remained in Greenland, her status now as a widow living among her father's household and the broader community. She would have returned to the rhythm of women's work, finding solace perhaps in the familiar motions of spinning and weaving, in the daily tasks that demanded attention and left little room for dwelling on loss. It was during this time that she met Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic merchant who had come to Greenland to trade. The saga describes him as wealthy and well-born, a man of good reputation. Their courtship, if it can be called that, would have followed the usual patterns: conversations in the communal spaces of the Longhouse, observations of character and capability, negotiations about practical matters, and eventually marriage. With Thorfinn came a new possibility, a journey even more ambitious than the one that had brought Gudrid to Greenland. Word had spread of lands further west, discovered by Leif Erikson, forests and meadows, places the Norse called Vinland. Thorfinn was organizing an expedition to explore these lands, to attempt settlement, to see if Norse people could make lives in this Western world. And Gudrid chose to go with him. The decision would have required courage of a particular kind. She was pregnant by this time, carrying new life within her body as she prepared to sail into the unknown. The nights before departure must have been filled with complex emotions: excitement at the adventure, fear for the child growing inside her, awareness that she might never return. She would have placed her hands on her belly in the darkness, feeling the small movements there, whispering prayers to Freya or other gods associated with childbirth and protection. The voyage to Vinland was longer than the journey from Iceland to Greenland. Days stretched into weeks as the small fleet of ships pushed westward, following the coast southward, seeking the lands Leif had described. Gudrid slept on the ship with her pregnancy advancing, her body changing, the child within her perhaps responding to the constant motion of the waves. When they finally reached Vinland, somewhere on the coast of what we now call North America, though the exact location remains debated, Gudrid stepped into a world utterly unlike anything Norse people had known before. The forests were different, dominated by species that had no names in her language. The air smelled different, rich with unfamiliar vegetation. Even the light seemed different somehow, falling through leaves that were not the pine and birch of Scandinavia. They built shelters, impermanent structures meant to last for the duration of their stay. These were not the solid longhouses of home, but cruder affairs. Still, they had walls and roofs and hearths. Still they offered shelter from the elements. And in one of these temporary dwellings, as winter approached in this strange land, Gudrid went into labor. The saga records that she gave birth to a son whom they named Snorri. This child, born sometime around the year 1000 or 1001, was likely the first person of European descent born in the Americas. But the saga records this fact without drama, simply noting it as another event in the sequence of events. For Gudrid, the experience would have been profoundly physical and immediate: the hours of labor, the pain, the final moment of birth, then the exhaustion and relief that follows. Her first nights with the newborn, in that crude shelter in Vinland, would have been unlike any other nights in her life. The sleeplessness of new motherhood is universal. The infant waking every few hours to feed, the constant vigilance, the hyper-awareness of this small, fragile life dependent entirely on her. But she was experiencing this in a place thousands of miles from any Norse settlement, surrounded by forests inhabited by peoples her culture had no knowledge of, in a season that was neither quite the winter she knew nor something entirely different. The child Snorri would have nursed at her breast, in the dim light of the hearth, his small sounds the only sound in the deep night. Gudrid would have held him, studying his tiny features, marveling as all mothers do at the perfection of fingers and toes, the softness of skin, the mysterious person this baby would someday become. And in those quiet hours, she might have wondered about his future, what kind of life awaited him, whether they would stay in this new land or return to Greenland or Iceland. The settlement in Vinland did not last. The sagas mention conflicts with the indigenous peoples whom the Norse called Skrælings, encounters that sometimes turned violent. They mention internal tensions among the Norse settlers themselves, disagreements about leadership and resources. The exact reasons for abandonment remain unclear, but within a few years the Norse gave up their attempt to colonize Vinland and prepared to return north. So Gudrid found herself once again on a ship, but now with a small child to care for during the voyage. The nights at sea with an infant would have been exponentially more difficult than her previous crossings. Snorri would have been confused and frightened by the constant motion, crying more than usual, difficult to soothe. Gudrid would have held him through the darkness, singing soft songs, offering comfort when she herself felt little comfort, being the island of stability her child needed even while the ship pitched beneath them. They returned to Greenland first, spending time there before eventually making their way back to Iceland. Each stage of the journey would have had its own character of nights, the relief of solid ground after weeks at sea, the gradual return to familiar patterns of life, the slow fading of the intense strangeness of Vinland into memory and then into story. Back in Iceland, Gudrid and Thorfinn established a farm. Here, in landscapes that were familiar, even if the specific place was new, they built a life. More children came. The saga mentions a daughter, though her name is not recorded. The years passed in the usual rhythm of farming life, seasons cycling, animals born and slaughtered, crops planted and harvested, children growing. Gudrid's nights in these middle years would have been the ordinary nights of a prosperous farmer's wife. She would have lain beside Thorfinn in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of an Icelandic longhouse, the structure and rhythms she had known since childhood. The extraordinary journeys of her youth settled into memory, becoming the stories she told her children, the experiences that marked her as unusual among her neighbors. When Thorfinn died, the saga doesn't record the year or cause. Gudrid was widowed for a second time. She was older now, her children grown, or nearly so, her place in the world secure through land and family connections. But the loss would still have cut deeply. The empty space in the bed where Thorfinn had lain, the silence where his breathing had been, the return of that particular loneliness that widowhood brings. The saga tells us something remarkable about Gudrid's final years. After Thorfinn's death, she undertook a pilgrimage to Rome, an extraordinary journey for anyone from Iceland, but especially for a woman, and especially for someone who had already travelled more widely than almost any Norse person of her generation. She walked the pilgrim roads southward through Europe, eventually reaching the heart of Catholic Christendom, seeing lands and peoples that made even Vinland seem less strange by comparison. We can only imagine the nights of that journey. Gudrid, now perhaps in her 50s or 60s, sleeping in pilgrim hostels and monasteries, surrounded by languages she didn't speak and customs she didn't understand. The beds would have been different, straw pallets in communal dormitories, harder or softer than what she knew, smelling of different herbs and different kinds of human proximity. She would have lain awake sometimes in the darkness, listening to the breathing of strangers, reflecting on how far she had come in both distance and years from that childhood longhouse in Iceland. The saga says that upon returning to Iceland after her pilgrimage, Gudrid became a nun, living out her final years in religious seclusion. The church was relatively new to Iceland in her lifetime. Conversion had occurred around the year 1000 during her young adulthood, and the monastic life would have represented yet another completely different experience of daily existence and nightly rest. In a convent, sleep would have been structured by the liturgical hours. Gudrid would have risen in the middle of the night for prayers, would have lain down and risen according to the bells that marked the divisions of time, would have slept in a small cell rather than the communal warmth of a longhouse. This final transformation of her sleeping life would have been profound, from the crowded intimacy of Norse households to the solitary cell of a religious woman. What did she think about in those final nights? Did she remember the Longhouse of her childhood, the ship, voyages across grey seas, the strange forests of Vinland where her son was born? Did she remember Thore and Thorfinn, the two men she had married and lost? Did she remember the younger version of herself, uncertain and brave in equal measure, stepping onto ships bound for unknown places? The saga cannot tell us these internal experiences. It records the external facts: born in Iceland, travelled to Greenland, journeyed to Vinland, returned to Iceland, went to Rome, became a nun, but the inner life remains hidden. Yet we can infer something about Gudrid's character from the life she lived. She was someone who faced change repeatedly and adapted, who met loss and continued, who was capable of both domestic routine and extraordinary adventure. Her nights, across the decades, would have contained all the varieties of sleep that a Viking life could offer. The deep, exhausted sleep of childhood in a crowded longhouse, the broken sleep of sea voyages on pitching ships, the vigil sleep beside dying loved ones, the half-wakeful alertness of new motherhood, the comfortable rhythms of married life in middle age, the strange alertness of travel in foreign lands, the structured sleeping of monastic life. Through all these transformations, some essential core of her remained, whatever it was that made her Gudrid, that allowed her to carry her identity across such vast changes of circumstance. And each night, wherever she found herself, she would have performed the small rituals of preparing for sleep, settling her body into whatever bedding was available, pulling coverings around herself, closing her eyes against whatever darkness surrounded her, and letting consciousness slip away into the universal human experience of sleep. The saga, in its final mention of Gudrid, says simply that she lived to a great age. We don't know exactly when she died or what her last nights were like. Perhaps in her cell in the convent, she felt death approaching, as the old often do. Perhaps she welcomed it, tired after such a long and full life. Perhaps she was afraid, facing that final unknown as she had faced so many unknowns before. But what we can say with certainty is that Gudrid's life, and by extension her nights, encompassed a remarkable range of human experience. She slept in 4 different lands across the North Atlantic. She slept as a child, as a wife, as a widow, as a mother, as a pilgrim, as a nun. She slept in warmth and in cold, in safety and in danger, in comfort and in grief. And through it all, she demonstrated that fundamental human capacity to rest wherever rest is possible, to find sleep even in difficult circumstances, to wake the next morning and continue. This resilience, perhaps more than any specific achievement, is what her story offers to us. She was not a queen or a warrior or a saint, but an ordinary woman who lived an extraordinary life and who, each night, found whatever rest the world would grant her before facing another day. In this way, Gudrid's nights illuminate the larger Viking experience of sleep. They show us that rest was not a luxury or a simple state, but something that had to be found, created, maintained through all the changes and challenges that life brought. They show us that sleep evolved with circumstances but remained essential, a constant need met in varying ways as life unfolded. When we imagine Gudrid's final sleep, that last time she closed her eyes, sometime in the mid-11th century, we might picture her old, her body worn by decades of labour and travel, her mind full of memories that spanned half the world. Perhaps she dreamed one last time of Vinland's strange forests, or of the ships that had carried her across so many seas, or of faces she had loved and lost. Perhaps she simply slipped from sleeping into death without drama, as peacefully as she had slipped into sleep thousands of nights before. The saga doesn't tell us, but it doesn't need to. Gudrid's life, traced through documents and archaeology and inference, gives us a window into how Vikings experienced not just sleep, but life itself, as a series of nights and days each one to be endured or enjoyed, each one offering both hardship and possibility. She carried the Viking world with her wherever she went, including the particular relationship with rest and darkness that her culture had developed. And in the end, she returned to the earth somewhere in Iceland, completing a circle that had taken her farther than almost anyone of her time before bringing her home. The Vikings did not sleep alone, even when they slept in solitude. This is not a metaphorical statement, but rather a reflection of their understanding of reality. A cosmos populated by beings and forces that did not respect the boundary between seen and unseen, between waking and sleeping, between the living and the dead. To understand Viking sleep fully, we must enter this shadowy territory where belief and experience intermingled, where dreams were not merely neural events, but potential communications from elsewhere. The night was not empty for these people. It was crowded with presences, thick with possibility, alive with forces that moved according to their own purposes. Begin with the simplest observation. The Vikings believed dreams could carry meaning. This was not unique to their culture. Most traditional societies have viewed dreams as potentially significant, but the specific character of Norse dream belief shaped how they experienced the night. A dream was not automatically dismissed as random neural firing or wish fulfillment or the product of an indigestible meal. Instead, each dream carried the possibility of being something more, a window, a message, a glimpse into the patterns that governed existence. The sagas are full of prophetic dreams, recounted with the same matter-of-fact tone used for any other event. Someone dreams of a goose covered in blood, and later their daughter is killed. Someone dreams of a ship sinking and refuses to travel on a particular voyage that indeed ends in disaster. Someone dreams of a woman in white who gives a warning, and the warning proves accurate. These accounts were written down long after the events they describe, but they reflect a consistent pattern. Dreams were taken seriously as potential sources of knowledge. Imagine, then, how this belief would have affected the experience of waking from a vivid dream in the middle of the night. You lie there in the darkness of the Longhouse, your heart perhaps racing from some intense dream experience, and you must decide, was this merely a dream, or was it a warning, a message, a glimpse of something true? The uncertainty itself would have created a particular quality of nighttime consciousness, a sense that sleep was not simply rest, but also a kind of threshold experience. This was not the passive unconsciousness of modern sleep theory, but something more active, more fraught with significance. Some dreams, in Norse belief, came from the gods. Odin, the All-Father, was particularly associated with hidden knowledge and prophecy, his single eye seeing into depths that remained obscure to ordinary mortals. To dream of ravens, Odin's birds, Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, might be understood as receiving attention from the god himself. To dream of battles might indicate Odin's interest in you as a potential warrior for his hall in the afterlife, a prospect both honoring and deeply unsettling. These were not comfortable beliefs, but rather ones that placed weight and significance on the sleeping mind. The gods were not distant, abstract powers in Norse cosmology, but active participants in human affairs, prone to interference, capable of reaching into mortal dreams with their own agendas. Other dreams might come from the dead. The boundary between the living and the dead was not absolute in Norse cosmology. It was permeable, crossable, subject to breach under certain conditions. The dead dwelt in various afterlife realms, the warriors in Valhalla, others in Hell's domain, some in the halls of Freya, but they were not necessarily cut off from the living world. Ancestors might appear in dreams to offer guidance or warnings to their descendants, their voices carrying across the divide that death had created. A recently deceased family member might visit in dreams to communicate something important or to seek something they needed. These visitations were not always gentle or welcome. Sometimes the dead came with demands, with grievances, with unfinished business that troubled both their rest and that of the living. This belief had practical effects on how people prepared for sleep. The small rituals performed before lying down, the touch of an amulet, the whispered prayer, the checking of protective symbols, were not merely superstition, but rather reasonable precautions in a world where the night was understood to be permeable to influences both benevolent and malevolent. You were preparing to cross a threshold, to enter a state where you were vulnerable, and it made sense to take measures to ensure your safety. These preparations were as routine as checking that weapons were within reach or that the fire was properly banked, practical responses to a reality that included both physical and spiritual dimensions. Runes played a role in this protective framework. The runic alphabet was not simply a writing system, but was invested with magical and spiritual significance, each character resonating with power beyond its merely communicative function. Specific runes were associated with protection, with warding off harm, with ensuring safe passage through danger. Archaeological evidence shows us runes carved into wooden bedposts, inscribed on amulets, marked on doorframes. These were not decorative but functional, meant to create a protected space, a zone where harmful influences could not easily penetrate. The specific function of these protective runes is now largely opaque to us. The meanings and uses of runes were probably never systematized in the way that later magical systems would be. They were folk practices, varying by region and practitioner, passed down through families or learned from local specialists. But their presence throughout the Norse world indicates a consistent belief that symbols could offer protection, that the carved marks could somehow influence the invisible forces that moved through the world. The runes were not prayers to distant gods, but rather active technologies, tools for shaping reality in subtle but meaningful ways. Consider what this meant psychologically. When you lay down to sleep, you did so within a space that had been symbolically protected, its boundaries marked and reinforced by the accumulated weight of tradition and belief. The runes on the bedpost or the amulet around your neck were tangible reminders that you had taken steps to ensure your safety in the vulnerable state of sleep. This might have functioned similarly to how a child's nightlight functions, not because it actually prevents any real danger, but because it provides psychological comfort that allows for rest. But the Norse cosmos contained genuine threats, or what were understood as such. The Draugr, the undead, the restless dead, who had not gone peacefully to their rest, represented a particular source of nighttime anxiety. These were not the shambling corpses of later zombie fiction, but rather something more ambiguous and more troubling. Dead who retained intelligence and malevolence, who might have reasons to harm the living, who could be encountered at boundaries and thresholds. The Draugr were memory and grudge made manifest, the past refusing to remain safely buried. The circumstances that might create a Draugr were various. Someone who died violently or untimely might not rest well, their spirit clinging to the world with the same desperation they had felt in their final moments. Someone who had been greedy or cruel in life might cling to the material world after death, unable to release their grip on possessions and power. Someone whose burial rites were not properly performed might be unable to complete the journey to the afterlife, trapped in a liminal state between worlds. The anxiety about proper treatment of the dead, the care taken with burials, the offerings made, the rituals performed, stemmed partly from genuine grief and respect, but also from the practical concern that mistreating the dead could have consequences for the living. This was not abstract ethics, but rather a matter of concrete safety, ensuring that those who departed did so peacefully and without reason to return. Stories of Draugr encounters often feature nighttime settings. This is partly narrative convention. Ghost stories naturally gravitate toward darkness, but it also reflects the genuine Norse understanding that night was when boundaries grew thin. The same darkness that provided rest also provided cover for things that did not belong to the daylight world. When you woke in the deep middle of the night, hearing a sound you couldn't immediately identify, the thought of Draga might surface unbidden, unwanted, but difficult to entirely dismiss. Yet, it's important not to overstate the fear. These beliefs existed alongside practical, pragmatic attitudes toward life and death. The Vikings were not paralyzed by supernatural terror any more than modern people are paralyzed by fears of crime or accident. The same person who believed Draga were possible also went about daily life without constant terror, slept soundly most nights, did not see supernatural threats lurking everywhere. The beliefs created a framework for understanding unusual experiences, but they did not dominate every moment of consciousness. The concept of the landvettir, land spirits or land wights, provided another layer to the unseen world that surrounded Viking sleep. These were beings associated with specific places, neither gods nor ancestors, but something else entirely, perhaps pre-existing the human habitation of the land. They needed to be treated with respect, appeased with small offerings, acknowledged in the way one might acknowledge a powerful neighbor whose goodwill matters. The landvettir were the original inhabitants, and humans were, in a sense, tenants who needed to maintain proper relations with their landlords. When Vikings built new farmsteads, they might leave offerings for the landvettir, seeking permission to inhabit the land and promising to treat it well. When ships approached Iceland, the law required that dragon-head prows be removed lest they frighten the land spirits, a legal requirement that encoded spiritual belief into civil regulation. These were not understood as superstitions, but as reasonable protocols for interacting with a world that was alive in ways beyond just plants and animals. The land itself had awareness, had preferences, had the capacity to bless or curse human endeavors depending on how it was treated. At night, in the quiet darkness, the landvettir were understood to be more active. This belief would have shaped how people experienced nighttime sounds, the creak of wood, the rustle in the grass outside, the sense of presence that darkness can create. These sounds were not necessarily threatening, but they were reminders that the land itself had its own life, its own rhythms, its own awareness that persisted regardless of human activity. The night belonged to the landvettir in a way that the day did not. Humans retreated indoors and the spirits moved more freely through the landscape. Dreams of landscapes, of hills opening up to reveal hidden halls, of being led by strange figures to remarkable places, were sometimes understood as encounters with the landvettir or related beings. These dreams had a different quality than ordinary dreams, or so it was believed. They felt more real, more solid, more memorable. Upon waking, the dreamer might be left with a sense of having actually traveled somewhere, of having experienced something that transcended mere imagination. Some people claim to remember details of these otherworldly places with unusual clarity, as if the experience had been encoded differently than normal dreams. The archaeological record offers some support for the importance of dreams and the unseen world in Norse life. Grave goods include amulets and charms, protective objects meant to safeguard the deceased in whatever came after death. The care taken with burials, the positioning of bodies, the selection of objects to include, the construction of burial mounds or ships, indicates a sophisticated understanding of death as a transition rather than an ending, and therefore of the dead as still somehow present or capable of presence. The elaborate ship burials in particular suggest a journey metaphor that implied continued existence and activity. Excavations of longhouses have revealed small caches of objects that seem to have ritual significance. A collection of unusual stones, careful arrangements of animal bones, traces of burned herbs. These artifacts suggest practices aimed at influencing unseen forces, at creating protective or propitious conditions. Some of these caches are found near sleeping areas, implying that nighttime protection was specifically considered important. The placement was not random but deliberate, suggesting that certain spots within the Longhouse were understood as particularly vulnerable or particularly in need of spiritual reinforcement. The herbs are particularly intriguing. Pollen analysis and preserved plant remains show that Vikings had access to various plants we now know have calming properties: chamomile, valerian, lavender, when it could be obtained through trade. Whether these were used deliberately as sleep aids is speculative, but the knowledge of which plants affected mood and consciousness certainly existed. Völur, the female shamans or seers of Norse culture, used various substances to achieve trance states, and this knowledge of plant effects likely extended to more mundane household uses as well. Imagine, then, a complete picture of Norse nighttime practice. Before sleep, small rituals, checking the protective runes, perhaps burning a pinch of herb, whispering a prayer to Thor for protection or to Freya for good dreams. The touching of amulets, the settling into familiar sleeping places, the communal proximity of family providing psychological safety. Then the descent into sleep, understanding that you were crossing a threshold into a realm where different rules applied, where the self became more porous and the world more mysterious. The nighttime soundscape would have been interpreted through this framework. The wind howling around the Longhouse was just wind, until it wasn't, until its voice seemed to carry intention or message, until it sounded like words or warnings. The creaking of timbers was just the structure settling, until it sounded like footsteps, like something moving with purpose through the darkness. Every sound carried potential significance, and the interpretation of sounds would have shaped the quality of waking and half-waking consciousness during the night. When you woke from a disturbing dream, you would lie in the darkness trying to assess its meaning. Was it a true dream or a false one ascending from elsewhere, or merely your own mind spinning fantasies? Did it carry a warning that should be heeded, or was it merely your own fears manifesting? In the morning, you might recount it to family members, seeking their interpretation, comparing it to patterns they recognized from previous dreams or traditional dream lore. If it seemed particularly significant, you might consult someone with specialized knowledge, a völva or a godi, who could offer insight into what the dream portended. These specialists maintained catalogues of dream symbolism, understanding what certain images or narratives traditionally signified, though they also relied on intuition and their own access to hidden knowledge. This is where we encounter one of the great mysteries of Viking sleep. To what extent did belief create experience? If you thoroughly believe that dreams can be prophetic, do you have different dreams than someone who believes dreams are merely neural noise? If you believe the night is populated by unseen beings, does this belief actually shape what you experience in the darkness? The relationship between expectation and perception is complex, and we cannot simply dismiss Viking experiences as entirely culturally constructed any more than we can accept them uncritically as objective encounters with supernatural beings. Modern sleep research suggests that cultural beliefs do indeed influence dream content and sleep experiences. People dream in culturally specific ways, incorporating the symbols and narratives their culture provides, their sleeping minds working with the raw material their waking lives have given them. The Vikings, then, would have had dreams populated by their gods, their ancestors, their culturally specific understanding of the cosmos. A Christian in medieval Europe might dream of angels and demons. A Viking might dream of ravens and ship burials and the halls of the slain. But there's another possibility worth considering. Perhaps some of the experiences the Vikings attributed to communication with the unseen world were actually forms of sleep phenomena we now understand differently. Sleep paralysis, the experience of waking but being unable to move, often accompanied by a sense of presence or pressure, is a universal human experience that gets interpreted through cultural lenses. In Viking culture, such an experience might have been understood as an encounter with a draga or a landvet or some other non-human entity. The terrifying sense of a weight on the chest, the inability to cry out, the feeling of malevolent presence, all of these features of sleep paralysis would have fit perfectly into the Norse understanding of nighttime spiritual encounters. Hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations, the vivid sensory experiences that can occur at the threshold between sleeping and waking, might have been similarly interpreted. That moment when you're not quite asleep but not fully awake, when you might hear voices or see figures or experience odd sensations, was understood not as a quirk of neurology but as evidence of the thinness of the boundary between worlds. In this sense, Viking belief and Viking experience reinforced each other. The beliefs provided a framework for interpreting ambiguous experiences, and the experiences confirmed the beliefs, a self-reinforcing system that was neither purely subjective nor purely objective but something more complex. This is not to dismiss the beliefs as false. In many ways, the question of objective truth is less interesting than the question of how the beliefs shaped life as it was lived. For a Viking lying awake in the darkness, whether Draugr really existed, was less important than the fact that the possibility of Draugr shaped how they experienced and responded to the night. The same psychological dynamic that made the Vikings formidable warriors might have also affected their sleep. They were a culture comfortable with violence, familiar with death, possessed of a certain fatalism that came from their religious beliefs. The concept of wired fate, the idea that your doom was already determined, meant that excessive worry about death was somewhat pointless. This attitude might have produced a certain psychological freedom, including freedom from the kind of anxiety that disrupts sleep. If you believe that your fate is already written, that the day of your death is determined regardless of your precautions, then there's less reason to lie awake worrying about all the things that might go wrong. You take reasonable precautions, you carry weapons, you post guards, you perform protective rituals, but then you rest, trusting that if it's your time, and if it's not, you'll wake to face another day. The attitude toward the afterlife also mattered. Unlike some religious systems that promise punishment for moral failings, the Norse afterlife was more about honor and reputation than about ethical behavior in a universal sense. What mattered was how you were remembered, whether you died well, whether your deeds would be spoken of after your death. This focus on reputation rather than divine judgment might have created different nighttime anxieties, less fear of supernatural punishment, more concern about living in a way that would be worthy of remembrance. The Völur, the female seers, occupied a special place in this nighttime cosmos. These women were understood to have particular access to hidden knowledge, the ability to perceive things others could not perceive, to navigate the boundaries between worlds with greater skill and safety. They performed rituals, went into trances, spoke prophecies. Some of their practices involved deliberate manipulation of consciousness, chanting, meditation, use of mind-altering substances, to achieve states where the boundary between the seen and unseen became more permeable. What did the Völur experience in these altered states? The historical record can only tell us what observers reported, not what the subjective experience was like, not what it felt like from the inside to journey between worlds. But we can infer that they encountered visions, heard voices, had experiences they understood as communication with gods or spirits or the dead. Whether these experiences came from external sources or were generated internally was probably not a distinction they would have found meaningful. The experience itself and the knowledge or insight it provided was what mattered. For ordinary people, the existence of the Völur provided a resource for dealing with troubling dreams or nighttime experiences. If you had a dream that disturbed you, if you experienced something in the night that you couldn't explain, you could consult a Völva and receive interpretation or advice. This outsourcing of uncertainty might itself have been psychologically helpful, allowing people to rest easier, knowing that if something truly important occurred, it could be properly assessed and addressed. The Völler served as intermediaries, translators between the ordinary world and the realm of hidden knowledge. The seasonal variation in daylight would have dramatically affected the nighttime experience of the unseen world. During the long polar nights of winter, when darkness stretched for most of each day, the sense of being immersed in the realm of shadows and spirits would have been inescapable. The boundaries that seemed clearer in summer's bright light dissolved in winter's endless twilight. Conversely, during the brief summer nights when darkness never fully descended, the unseen world might have seemed more distant, less immediately present, less pressing upon consciousness. This seasonal oscillation between different qualities of darkness would have created an annual rhythm to spiritual life, just as it created rhythms to physical life. Winter was a time for sitting around fires telling stories, for the dead seeming close, for dreams being particularly vivid and meaningful. Summer was a time for action and activity, for the physical world demanding full attention, for the unseen receding into the background of consciousness. The Vikings lived in synchrony with these cycles, adjusting their relationship with the invisible world according to the season. The relationship between the Vikings and their unseen cosmos was not primarily one of fear, though fear was certainly present. It was more a relationship of negotiation and navigation, of learning to move skillfully through a landscape that included dimensions both visible and invisible. The unseen world was dangerous but not incomprehensible. There were protocols for interacting with it, precautions one could take, specialists who could help when needed. This gave people a sense of agency rather than helplessness. You might not be able to control whether a draga existed, but you could control whether you treated your dead properly. You might not be able to command the landvettir, but you could show them respect, make appropriate offerings, avoid actions that would anger them. This sense of agency extended to the practice of sleep itself. Sleep was not something that simply happened or didn't happen based on uncontrollable factors. It was something you prepared for through ritual, something you protected through symbols and prayers, something you navigated with awareness of its spiritual dimensions. The physical and spiritual aspects of sleep were not separated in Viking thinking. They were unified aspects of a single experience. To sleep well was not merely a matter of physical comfort, but also of spiritual preparation, of ensuring that you had done what was necessary to make the night safe. Archaeological discoveries continue to add nuance to our understanding. A recent excavation in Norway revealed a burial where the deceased had been laid to rest, with stones placed over the body, not as a sign of disrespect, but possibly as a precaution to ensure the dead would not walk. This practice, occurring in various forms throughout the Norse world, indicates how seriously the possibility of the restless dead was taken. The living took concrete steps to ensure their dead remained peacefully in their graves, treating the threat of draga as a practical concern, requiring practical solutions. Another excavation in Iceland uncovered a farmstead where one room seemed to have been specifically dedicated to ritual purposes. The artifacts found there, carefully arranged stones, traces of burned offerings, carved wooden objects of unclear function, suggest a space set aside for interacting with the unseen world. This was not a temple in the formal sense, but rather a household shrine, indicating that spiritual practice was woven into daily life rather than separated into a distinct religious sphere. The sacred and the mundane occupied the same physical and conceptual space. The Norse cosmos, as reconstructed from sagas and archaeology and comparative mythology, was complex and layered. Multiple afterlife realms existed simultaneously, each with its own character and requirements for entry. Gods were powerful but not omnipotent, subject themselves to fate, capable of being wounded or even killed. Giants and monsters lurked at the edges of the ordered world, always threatening to break through, held at bay by the gods' constant vigilance, but never permanently defeated. Time itself was understood cyclically, with the world destined to end in Ragnarok only to be reborn afterward. This cosmological complexity meant that sleep existed within a rich, symbolic framework. When you closed your eyes, you were not simply shutting down consciousness for a period of rest. You were entering a state where the normal boundaries of self and world became more porous, where you might travel in dreams to other realms, where you were vulnerable but also potentially open to knowledge and experience unavailable in waking life. Sleep was a kind of journey, and like any journey, it required preparation and awareness. The very architecture of the Longhouse reflected this understanding of layered realities. The structure was oriented carefully, aligned with cardinal directions or significant landscape features, its placement in the world not arbitrary, but meaningful. The door faced a particular direction, the hearth occupied the center, the sleeping platforms were positioned deliberately. These were not random choices, but rather ways of anchoring the human dwelling within a larger cosmic order, of ensuring that the space provided not just physical shelter, but spiritual protection as well. We might consider the Longhouse itself as a kind of protective symbol, a human-made boundary between the ordered world of culture and the chaotic world of nature and spirits. Inside, firelight and human presence created a zone of relative safety, a bubble of warmth and sociability carved out of the darkness. Outside, darkness and wilderness contained forces that were at best indifferent, and at worst actively hostile to human well-being. The walls were not just wood, but also symbolic barriers, and the rituals performed within them reinforced their protective function. The practice of keeping animals inside the Longhouse during winter had spiritual dimensions beyond just practical warmth sharing. Animals were understood to have their own relationships with the unseen world, their own sensitivities to presences and disturbances that humans might miss. Dogs might bark at things humans couldn't see. Horses might refuse to enter certain areas as if sensing something wrong, their instincts providing information their human companions lacked. The presence of animals was companionable but also provided a kind of early warning system for spiritual disturbances. Their senses extended human awareness, offering another layer of protection against threats that might approach unseen. There are accounts in the sagas of animals behaving strangely before supernatural events. A horse refuses to approach a burial mound, fighting its rider's efforts to compel it forward. A dog growls at empty air, its hackles raised, its attention fixed on something invisible to human eyes. Cattle become restless without apparent cause, moving in agitation, sensing some disturbance in the normal order of things. These behaviors were taken seriously as indicators that something in the unseen world was active. For people sleeping in proximity to these animals, their sounds and movements became part of the nighttime information stream, signals to be interpreted and assessed. The sudden barking of a dog might mean an intruder, or it might mean something else entirely. The question remains, one that cannot be definitively answered, whether the Vikings slept deeply because they trusted their protections against the unseen world, or despite their awareness of it. Did the belief in protective runes and proper rituals create sufficient sense of safety to allow deep rest? Or did the awareness of potential spiritual dangers create an underlying vigilance that lightened sleep, keeping consciousness closer to the surface, ready to respond to any disturbance? The answer likely varied by individual temperament and by specific circumstances, by personality and by situation. On a night when dreams had been troubling, when sounds in the darkness seemed meaningful, when something had happened during the day to provoke spiritual anxiety, sleep might have been lighter, more fitful. The mind would hover near wakefulness, monitoring, assessing, unable to fully let go into deep unconsciousness. On ordinary nights, when rituals had been properly performed and nothing seemed amiss, sleep might have come easily, the protections offering psychological comfort that facilitated rest. The same person might sleep very differently from one night to the next, depending on context and recent experience. What we can say with more certainty is that the Viking relationship with the unseen world was dynamic rather than static. It was not a fixed set of superstitions mindlessly followed, but rather an ongoing negotiation with mystery, a living tradition that evolved in response to experience. When experiences occurred that the cultural framework couldn't adequately explain, the framework adapted. New interpretations emerged, new practices developed. The understanding of how the unseen world worked continued to evolve. The tradition was alive, growing, responding to the challenges and questions that arose. This adaptability is evident in how Norse culture responded to Christianity when it began to spread through Scandinavia. Rather than simply replacing the old beliefs overnight, there was a period of syncretism where Christian and pagan ideas intermingled, where people navigated between frameworks. People might wear both Thor's hammer and a cross, might invoke both the old gods and the Christian god, might interpret dreams through multiple frameworks simultaneously. This suggests a pragmatic attitude toward the unseen. What mattered was effectiveness, whether beliefs and practices actually helped navigate life's uncertainties. In the end, the mystery of Viking sleep is inseparable from the mystery of Viking consciousness itself. How did it feel to inhabit a mind that understood reality in these ways, to perceive the world through this particular cultural lens? To experience dreams not as random neural events but as potential communications? To lie down at night knowing you were crossing a threshold into a realm where different rules applied, where the ordinary protections of daylight and activity no longer held? We can reconstruct the beliefs and practices, but the subjective experience remains elusive, separated from us by time and worldview. The archaeological evidence gives us objects and structures, the sagas give us stories and beliefs, but the inner life of a Viking preparing for sleep remains largely inaccessible to direct knowledge. Yet perhaps this elusiveness is appropriate. The Vikings themselves would have understood that some things resist complete explanation, that mystery is an essential feature of existence rather than a problem to be solved. The unseen world was, by definition, not fully knowable. You could learn to navigate it, develop wisdom about how to interact with it, accumulate practical knowledge about what worked and what didn't, but you could not master it or explain it away. And so they slept, surrounded by their symbols and rituals, embedded in their cultural framework, trusting in protections that were as much psychological as metaphysical. They slept deeply when exhaustion demanded it, lightly when circumstances warranted vigilance, and somewhere in between most nights. They woke from dreams they discussed and interpreted, or from dreamless sleep that offered pure rest. They carried their understanding of the unseen world with them through the darkness, letting it shape but not dominate their experience of the night. The archaeological and textual evidence will never give us complete access to this inner experience. We cannot know for certain whether a Viking farmer, waking at midnight and hearing a strange sound, experienced the same quality of fear and wonder that the written sagas suggest. We cannot measure the psychological effect of wearing a protective amulet or sleeping in a longhouse inscribed with runes. We cannot enter the dreams of people 1,000 years dead, cannot access their sleeping consciousness, cannot fully reconstruct what it felt like to be them in those dark hours. But we can recognize that the Vikings developed a sophisticated approach to managing the uncertainties of the night, an approach that combined practical measures, symbolic protections, communal support, and cosmological framework. This approach allowed them to find rest in a world that was harsh and unpredictable, to sleep despite awareness of dangers both physical and spiritual, to wake each morning ready to face another day in a demanding world. The system worked, in its way, providing both practical and psychological resources for navigating the vulnerability of sleep. The unseen world that watched them sleep was neither purely benevolent nor purely malevolent in Norse understanding. It was complex, multifaceted, requiring wisdom and respect rather than simple faith or fear, containing gods who might be capricious, ancestors who might be helpful or demanding, spirits who might be friendly or hostile depending on how they were treated. And the Vikings, practical people even in their spiritual lives, developed practices that allowed them to coexist with mystery rather than being paralyzed by it. They made peace with not knowing everything, with living in a world where the boundaries between possible and impossible were drawn differently than in later ages. This acceptance of mystery might itself have been conducive to rest. If you do not expect to understand everything, do not demand that reality conform to simple patterns. Do not require complete control over your circumstances. Then you can more easily surrender to sleep. You can let go into the darkness, trusting that whatever protections you have put in place are sufficient, that your fate will unfold as it will, regardless of your worrying, that the morning will come, and with it, another opportunity to navigate the complexities of existence. The fatalism that might seem depressing from a modern perspective might actually have been liberating in practice, freeing people from the burden of believing they could control everything. The communal nature of Viking sleep also deserves emphasis. Unlike modern individualized sleeping arrangements, where each person typically has their own room, or at least their own bed, Vikings slept in proximity to family members, in spaces where breath and warmth were shared. This proximity was partly practical. Bodies provided warmth in cold climates, and the Longhouse design concentrated people in the area near the hearth. But it also had psychological dimensions, creating a sense of safety through presence, the knowledge that you were not alone in the darkness. When a child woke, frightened from a dream, there were parents within arm's reach. When someone heard a disturbing sound, they could verify with others whether they heard it too, could assess the threat collectively rather than facing it in isolation. This communal approach to sleep meant that nighttime experiences were often shared and interpreted together rather than being purely individual. A particularly vivid dream might be recounted the next morning and become part of family lore, woven into the collective understanding of what the unseen world was doing and wanting. The long winter nights would have made this communal aspect especially important. When darkness stretched from mid-afternoon to mid-morning, when days were reduced to brief interludes of twilight, the Longhouse became the entire world for extended periods. The shared sleeping space became a kind of nest, a protected hollow in the vast darkness outside, and the rituals and protections that surrounded it took on added significance. The fire needed to be kept burning not just for warmth, but for what it represented: human presence, the ordered world, the light that kept the shadows at bay. The role of storytelling in Viking culture also intersected with sleep practices. The long evenings provided time for recounting sagas, for telling tales of gods and heroes, for passing on the accumulated wisdom and knowledge of the culture. These stories were not mere entertainment, but also education, teaching listeners about how the world worked, what behaviors were valued, what dangers existed, and how to navigate them. Many of these stories explicitly addressed nighttime themes, encounters with Draga, dreams that proved prophetic, the importance of proper burial rituals. By hearing these stories repeatedly, often during the evening hours before sleep, people absorbed a framework for interpreting their own nighttime experiences. When they had a strange dream or encountered something unsettling in the darkness, they had a catalogue of similar experiences to draw on, patterns to recognize, precedents to follow. The stories provided a map of the unseen world, not precise or complete, but better than nothing, and certainly better than facing the unknown without any cultural resources at all. The oral tradition was practical in this sense, serving a psychological function alongside its role in preserving cultural memory. We might also consider the role of music and poetry in the nighttime world of the Vikings. The skalds, the poet-bards of Norse culture, crafted complex verses that encoded history, mythology, and wisdom in memorable forms. Their poems were often performed in the evening in the gathered community of the Longhouse, creating a sonic environment that shaped the transition into sleep. The rhythms and rhymes of Old Norse poetry, the alliteration and kennings, created patterns that might have lingered in the mind as consciousness drifted towards sleep. Some evidence suggests that certain types of chanting or rhythmic speaking were used deliberately to induce trance states or to facilitate the boundary-crossing work of the volur. While most people would not have engaged in these specialized practices, they would have been aware of them, would have understood that sound and rhythm could affect consciousness. This knowledge might have influenced more ordinary nighttime practices, leading people to hum or chant softly to themselves as they prepared for sleep, using sound as a tool for managing the transition between states. The lullabies sung to children would have served this function, but adults too might have had their own versions, their own ways of using sound to ease the passage into sleep. The concept of hamingja, a kind of personal, spiritual power or luck that could be strong or weak, that could be inherited or earned, also relates to sleep and dreams. A person with strong hamingja was not only more likely to succeed in visible undertakings, but also more protected in the invisible realms. Dreams might be. Not all Vikings slept in the same way, in the same conditions, with the same quality of rest. Social hierarchy shaped every aspect of life, and sleep was no exception. To understand the complete picture of Viking sleep, we must examine how wealth and status created different nighttime experiences that were not necessarily more restful despite being more materially comfortable. This is one of the great ironies of Viking life. Those who had the softest beds sometimes slept the least soundly. Begin with the physical differences. A wealthy farmer or a successful chieftain would have lived in a longhouse that was larger, better constructed, more thoroughly insulated against the cold than the dwelling of a common farmer. The walls would have been made of higher quality timber, fitted more precisely together. The roof would have been more carefully thatched, less prone to leaks. The space would have been greater, allowing for more separation between different areas of the house. Inside such a longhouse, the sleeping arrangements would have been notably superior. Instead of the crude straw mattresses that commoners used, the wealthy might have had mattresses stuffed with down or wool, softer and more comfortable. Their blankets would have been finer wool, perhaps even including imported textiles, silk from distant trade routes, beautifully dyed and woven fabric that represented significant wealth. Their furs would have been more luxurious, bear and fox rather than the sheepskin available to everyone. Archaeological excavations of high-status sites have revealed evidence of these material differences. At wealthy farmsteads, researchers have found traces of textiles that include silk threads, fragments of elaborate weaving, evidence of dyes that would have been expensive to obtain. Beds appear to have been more elaborate structures, sometimes with carved wooden frames, decorative elements that turned functional furniture into status symbols. The sleeping platforms were larger, offering more space and therefore more physical comfort. Yet this material superiority came with its own complications. A wealthy Norse household was not simply a family unit, but a complex social entity containing many people with various relationships to the head of household. There would be family members, certainly, but also retainers, workers, guests, and possibly thralls, slaves who occupied the lowest rung of the social ladder. All of these people lived under the same roof, creating social dynamics that shaped the nighttime experience. The wealthy slept with an awareness of their position that commoners did not have to maintain. A chieftain or prosperous farmer was responsible not just for their immediate family, but for the broader household. They needed to ensure that everyone was fed, that disputes were settled fairly, that the complex social machinery of the household functioned smoothly. This responsibility created a different quality of nighttime consciousness, less the pure exhaustion that brings deep sleep, more a kind of vigilance that never entirely switches off. Consider the political dimension of high-status life in Viking society. Alliances between powerful families were essential, but also fragile. A chieftain needed to maintain relationships with other chieftains to navigate the complex web of obligations and feuds that structured Norse political life. Marriage alliances had to be carefully managed. Inheritance issues could create family tensions. Feuds, once started, could persist for generations, always carrying the possibility of violence. These political concerns did not disappear at night. A wealthy man lying in his comfortable bed might find his mind turning over the day's conversations, analyzing what someone said or didn't say, worrying about whether an alliance was solid or beginning to fray. The very networks of connection that brought power and wealth also brought anxiety. A common farmer worried about crops and animals, a chieftain worried about those things, plus the loyalty of allies and the intentions of rivals. The saga literature is full of accounts of feuds escalating through misunderstanding and pride, of alliances collapsing, of violence erupting suddenly from tensions that had been building for years. The men and women at the center of these dramas were the wealthy and powerful, and they lived with constant awareness that a wrong word or action could trigger consequences affecting entire families. This awareness would have shaped their sleep, perhaps making it lighter, more easily disturbed, less completely restorative. Women of high status faced their own particular pressures. In Norse society, women could own property, manage estates, and wield significant power within their sphere. But with this power came responsibility. A wealthy woman was expected to manage the household's economy, to oversee food production and textile work, to maintain hospitality, and to navigate the social dynamics among other women. When her husband was absent, traveling for trade or on raids, she held even more responsibility. The nights of a high-status woman might be spent partially awake, listening for problems that might require her attention. A sick child, certainly, but also disputes among household members, signs of theft or other problems, the thousand small crises that could emerge in a complex household. She slept with authority, but also with the burdens that authority brings. Her rest was punctuated by the need to be available, to respond, to maintain control, even in darkness. The physical space of elite sleeping quarters reflected social status in deliberate ways. Archaeological evidence suggests that in larger longhouses, the head of household and their spouse might have had a slightly more separated sleeping area, not a private room in the modern sense, but perhaps a platform that was more enclosed, marked off by decorative posts or hanging textiles. This separation was both practical and symbolic, denoting rank while still maintaining the communal nature of longhouse life. The decoration of these sleeping areas mattered. Carved bedposts with intricate patterns, hangings with elaborate weaving, the display of valuable objects nearby, all of these communicated status. But they also created a particular kind of sleeping environment, one where you were surrounded by symbols of your own wealth and position. Whether this promoted restful sleep or created a different kind of awareness, a consciousness of what you had and what you might lose, is difficult to determine. Feasting was central to elite Viking social life, and feasts had significant effects on sleep. A wealthy chieftain would host feasts to cement alliances, display generosity, and maintain status. These events involved excessive consumption of food and ale, entertainment, socializing that stretched late into the night. The host had to remain alert throughout, ensuring proper hospitality, managing any conflicts that arose, reading social dynamics and responding appropriately. The sleep that followed a feast would have been affected by alcohol consumption. The Vikings brewed ale and mead and drank them enthusiastically at social gatherings. Alcohol disrupts sleep architecture, reducing the quality of rest, even when it facilitates falling asleep initially. A chieftain who had hosted a successful feast might lie down feeling satisfied with the evening's outcome, but experience fragmented, unrestorative sleep. The next day would bring grogginess and the need to resume normal responsibilities despite not being fully rested. The presence of thralls in wealthy households created another dimension of the nighttime experience. These slaves, captured in raids or born into servitude, slept in the same longhouse but in markedly inferior conditions. They might be given the coldest sleeping positions near the door where drafts were strongest. Their bedding would be minimal, their furs the oldest and least warm. They slept with the knowledge of their low status, with the absence of any real control over their lives. For the masters of thralls, this created a psychological dynamic that must have affected sleep on some level. You slept comfortably knowing that others nearby slept poorly. You benefited from their labor during the day and from their inferior status at night. Whether this created guilt or simply seemed natural, the way things were and always had been, varied by individual, but it created a particular moral landscape that shaped consciousness. The elite also had more to lose, and this shaped nighttime worries in specific ways. A common farmer whose crops failed might face hardship, but a wealthy farmer whose ships were lost at sea could experience catastrophic loss of wealth and status. The stakes were higher, the potential for downward mobility more dramatic and more consequential. Anxiety about maintaining position, about protecting accumulated wealth, about ensuring inheritance for children, all of this created mental activity that could interfere with deep rest. Raiding added another layer of complexity to elite sleep. While not every wealthy Viking participated in raids, many did, and the anticipation of violence shaped consciousness in particular ways. In the days before departure on a raid, sleep might be difficult, excitement and fear combining to create restlessness. During the raid itself, on ships or in temporary camps in hostile territory, sleep would be minimal and hypervigilant. Upon return, laden with plunder or nursing injuries, sleep might be disturbed by the aftermath of violence witnessed and committed. The warriors who made up a chieftain's retinue lived with particular awareness of mortality. They were expected to be brave, to fight when called upon, to prioritize honor over safety. This created a certain fatalism that might have paradoxically facilitated sleep. If death could come at any time regardless of precautions, why lose sleep worrying about it? But it also created the psychological effects of living with violence, the ways that trauma and hypervigilance can become embedded in the nervous system. The saga literature portrays elite Viking sleep in ways that reflect these complexities. There are accounts of prophetic dreams that trouble chieftains, of sleepless nights before important decisions, of the restlessness that comes with political power. There are also accounts of warriors sleeping soundly before battle, their fatalism and courage creating a kind of peace. The elite sleep experience was varied and individual, but it carried burdens that material comfort could not entirely compensate for. Religious ritual was another area where status shaped sleep. While all Vikings participated in religious observances, the wealthy had special responsibilities. A chieftain might also be a Godi, a priest chieftain who conducted rituals and maintained sacred sites. This dual role brought additional layers of responsibility and concern. Did the sacrifices please the gods? Were the rituals performed correctly? What did dreams and omens signify for the community's welfare? The Volur, the female seers, often came from or served elite households. Their practices involved altered states of consciousness, journeys into the spirit world to gather information or insight. A wealthy family might host a vulva, provide her with what she needed for her rituals, and await her prophecies with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The presence of such a figure in the household would have created a particular spiritual atmosphere, a heightened awareness of the unseen world and its potential communications. Gender dynamics among the elite were complex and varied by region and time period. In some contexts, women of high status wielded considerable power, managing estates, and even, in rare cases, participating in military leadership. In others, their power was more constrained by male relatives. But regardless of the specific arrangements, elite women faced pressures that shaped their consciousness and therefore their sleep. They navigated social dynamics, protected family interests, and maintained the complex web of relationships that sustained their household's position. The question of inheritance created particular anxieties that could disturb sleep. Norse inheritance practices varied, but generally sons inherited land and movable property. This meant that families with multiple sons faced potential conflict over division of resources. Fathers might lie awake worrying about how to provide for all their sons without fragmenting the farm beyond viability. Mothers worried about their daughters' marriage prospects, about ensuring they were settled with good men in good circumstances. The wealthy also faced the peculiar burden of hosting. Hospitality was not optional in Norse culture. Refusing a traveller shelter and food was a serious breach of social norms. But this meant that wealthy households frequently had guests, sometimes expected, sometimes unexpected. These guests needed to be housed and fed, their presence accommodated within the household's rhythms. The heads of wealthy households slept, knowing they might be woken to receive travellers, that their generosity was constantly on display and being evaluated. Trade was another source of both wealth and anxiety for the elite. Those who engaged in long-distance trade, sailing to distant ports, exchanging goods across vast distances, could accumulate significant wealth. But trade was risky. Ships could sink, goods could be stolen, markets could shift unpredictably. A merchant lying in his comfortable bed might find his mind running through calculations, worrying about ships at sea, wondering whether ventures would prove profitable or disastrous. The accumulation of wealth itself created specific psychological effects. Archaeological evidence shows that wealthy Vikings collected remarkable objects, Arab coins, Byzantine silk, elaborate weapons, intricate jewelry. These objects were not just possessions, but markers of status, proof of successful voyages, evidence of connections to distant places. But they also needed to be protected, guarded against theft, maintained as visible symbols of position. The responsibility of protecting wealth could create its own vigilance. Wealth also meant better access to certain luxuries that might have affected sleep quality. Better food, including more meat and dairy, would have provided better nutrition overall. Access to imported goods might have included things that aided sleep, finer textiles that were softer and warmer, perhaps even rare substances that had calming effects. Yet these advantages had to be weighed against the stresses that came with maintaining high status. The elite were also more likely to travel, and travel disrupted normal sleep patterns. A chieftain visiting another household slept in unfamiliar surroundings, among people he might not fully trust, in circumstances that required continued alertness to social dynamics. Merchants traveled even more extensively, sleeping on ships and in foreign ports, their rest always somewhat provisional and guarded. The wealthy thus experienced more variety in their sleeping conditions, but this variety came at the cost of the deep security that familiarity provides. As the Norse world evolved, as Christianity spread, as kingdoms consolidated, as traditional structures began to shift, the elite were often at the center of these changes. They had to navigate new political arrangements, adopt new religious practices, adjust to new forms of social organization. This process of cultural transformation would have created particular anxieties, especially at night when the mind turns over the day's events and considers an uncertain future. The irony at the heart of elite Viking sleep is that those who had the most material comfort often had the least psychological ease. A common farmer, exhausted from physical labor, surrounded by family, with few political entanglements to worry about, might sink into deep restorative sleep despite rough bedding and cold air. A chieftain in his comfortable bed, with fine furs and ample space, might lie awake for hours, turning over political calculations, worrying about alliances and inheritance and reputation. This paradox suggests something important about sleep itself, that it is not primarily a function of comfort, but rather of psychological factors like security, predictability, and the absence of unresolved anxiety. The Vikings seem to have understood this intuitively, even if they couldn't articulate it in modern psychological terms. The rituals around sleep, the emphasis on proper protective measures, the value placed on communal closeness, all of these addressed psychological needs as much as physical ones. The archaeological record of elite graves shows us something poignant about how status accompanied people even into death. Wealthy individuals were buried in ships or elaborate chambers, surrounded by their possessions, their bodies arranged carefully, their graves marked with visible monuments. This care extended even to ensuring the dead would rest properly in the afterlife. The same anxieties about status that shaped elite sleep in life continued to shape how they were treated after death. Yet for all the complications and burdens that came with high status, the elite were still Vikings, still participants in the same cultural framework that shaped everyone's experience of sleep. They believed in the same gods, feared the same Draugr, practiced versions of the same protective rituals. Their nights were different in degree, but not entirely in kind from the nights of their poorer neighbours. They too closed their eyes in smoky longhouses, listened to wind howling outside, woke in the middle of the night to stir the fire, and gradually learned the particular rhythms and textures of sleep that their culture provided. In the end, the weight of status might have made certain kinds of deep, untroubled sleep more elusive for the elite. They had more responsibilities, more to protect, more complex social dynamics to navigate. But they also had resources to manage their challenges, specialists they could consult, allies they could rely on. They were not helpless in the face of sleeplessness, but rather actively engaged in managing their rest through whatever means their culture provided. And perhaps on some nights when political worries were distant, when the household was running smoothly, when the fire burned warm and families slept peacefully nearby, even the elite could find that deep, complete rest that all humans crave. Perhaps in those moments, the soft furs and fine textiles actually did provide enhanced comfort. The larger space actually did create a sense of security, and wealth fulfilled its promise of making life easier. Those nights, however, might have been rarer than for their poorer neighbours, whose exhaustion and simpler lives more reliably delivered them into deep sleep's embrace. We have travelled through many nights now across centuries and circumstances, from common longhouses to Vinland's strange forests, from the realm of dreams and spirits to the complicated beds of chieftains. The journey has revealed something that seems paradoxical from our modern perspective. The Vikings, living in conditions we would find nearly intolerable, often slept more deeply and perhaps more peacefully than many people do in the comfort and security of the contemporary world. This is not to romanticize their lives or to suggest that hardship is desirable. The Vikings suffered in ways we can barely imagine, from cold and hunger, from disease and injury, from violence and loss. Their lives were short by modern standards, their daily existence filled with labor that would exhaust us, their world lacking countless comforts and securities we take for granted. Yet within this harsh framework, they found rest. The key to understanding Viking sleep lies in recognizing what actually facilitates deep rest. It is not primarily material comfort, though comfort helps. It is not the absence of physical sensation, though pain certainly interferes with sleep. Rather, deep sleep seems to require a particular constellation of psychological and physical factors: genuine exhaustion, a sense of relative safety, the resolution or acceptance of uncertainty, and the absence of excessive mental stimulation. The Vikings achieved these conditions through the very structure of their lives. Their days were physically demanding to a degree that created real, profound exhaustion, not the mental tiredness of office work, but the full-body weariness that comes from hours of hard physical labor. This exhaustion was not a burden to be managed, but rather a natural consequence of survival in a demanding environment. When they lay down at night, their bodies demanded rest, and their minds had neither the energy nor the inclination to resist. The sense of safety they achieved was relative but real. The Longhouse walls, while not impermeable, provided shelter from the elements and symbolic protection from spiritual threats. The presence of family members sleeping nearby satisfied deep evolutionary needs for communal security. The rituals performed before sleep, the touching of amulets, the banking of fires, the whispering of prayers, created psychological comfort that facilitated letting go into unconsciousness. They could not control everything, but they had done what could be done. The acceptance of uncertainty that permeated Norse culture also contributed to restful sleep. The concept of weird, of fate that could not be avoided, meant that excessive worry was somewhat pointless. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. The gods would do as they pleased. Ships would return or would not. This fatalism, which might seem grim to modern sensibilities, actually created a kind of freedom from anxiety. You could plan and prepare, but ultimately you had to trust that your fate would unfold as it was meant to. The absence of excessive mental stimulation was perhaps most important. The Vikings lived in a world without artificial light, without constant information flow, without the barrage of images and sounds and text that characterizes modern existence. As darkness fell, activity naturally wound down. Conversations around the fire were soothing rather than stimulating. Stories were familiar, repeated with variation, but not containing shocking new information every night. The mind was allowed to slow down gradually rather than being jolted from high stimulation directly into the attempt to sleep. Compare this to the contemporary sleep environment where people often try to transition directly from brightly lit screens to darkened bedrooms, from social media's constant stimulation to the expectation of immediate unconsciousness. The nervous system has no opportunity to down-regulate gradually. The mind, fed exciting or disturbing content until the moment of lying down, continues to process and worry even when the body is still. Material comfort provides no compensation for this neurological dissonance. The Vikings also benefited from what sleep researchers now call good sleep hygiene without consciously thinking of it in those terms. Their sleep-wake cycle was closely tied to natural light, allowing their circadian rhythms to function optimally. They exercised extensively during the day, not in gyms but through the natural movement of labor, which promotes deeper sleep. They ate their last meal hours before sleep, allowing digestion to complete. They slept in cool, dark spaces, which facilitates the body's natural temperature drop during sleep. The social dimension of Viking sleep remains particularly relevant. They never slept truly alone. Family and community were always present, providing both practical security and deep psychological comfort. Modern people often sleep in isolated bedrooms, sometimes even in houses where they live alone, a degree of solitude that would have seemed bizarre and frightening to the Vikings. The loneliness epidemic of the contemporary world has sleep consequences that we are only beginning to fully understand. Yet we must acknowledge what the Vikings lost in their sleep as well. They experienced cold that we would find unbearable, pain that we would immediately seek to medicate, illnesses that would have been easily treated in later eras. Their nights contained real fears of raids, of predators, of the unknown, that were not merely psychological but grounded in genuine danger. Their sleep was not better in every way, but rather adapted to their specific circumstances in ways that often worked surprisingly well. Gudrid's journey showed us how sleep evolved with changing circumstances, how the same person could experience radically different qualities of rest across a lifetime, from the communal warmth of childhood to the disturbed sleep beside a dying spouse, from the strange alertness of motherhood in Vinland to the structured rest of monastic life. She adapted repeatedly, finding what rest each phase of life would allow. This adaptability is itself a lesson that sleep is not a fixed state, but rather something that shifts with circumstances, requiring flexibility and acceptance rather than rigid expectations. The mysteries of the Viking unseen world revealed how belief shapes experience, how cultural framework influences the subjective quality of consciousness in darkness. The Vikings did not sleep in the absence of meaning, but rather within a rich, symbolic universe that provided interpretation for ambiguous experiences. Their dreams carried significance, their night sounds had potential meaning, their darkness was populated with possibilities both threatening and transcendent. Whether this enhanced or disturbed their sleep likely varied by individual and circumstance, but it created a particular texture to nighttime consciousness that differs markedly from the more materialist mindset of modernity. The exploration of elite sleep taught us that comfort and ease do not automatically translate to restful sleep. The wealthy Vikings had softer beds but harder worries, more space but more responsibility, better food but greater anxiety about losing what they had. This remains true today. Wealth provides resources to address sleep problems but cannot by itself create the psychological conditions that facilitate deep rest. The executive in the luxury hotel room may sleep worse than the farmer in the simple cottage if their mind will not quiet. As we conclude this journey through Viking nights, we might ask what lessons their experience holds for us. Not that we should abandon modern comforts. Few would willingly give up heating and lighting and medicine to live as the Vikings did. But perhaps we can recognize that some elements of their lifestyle actually facilitated sleep better than aspects of contemporary life. The physical exhaustion that comes from regular movement, the gradual transition from activity to rest as light fades, the presence of close others during sleep, the acceptance of uncertainty rather than constant worry about controlling everything. We might also learn from their rituals, not the specific content of prayers to Thor and Odin, but rather the principle of marking the transition to sleep as significant, creating small ceremonies around bedtime, taking time to wind down, preparing the sleeping space thoughtfully. These practices acknowledge that sleep is important, that it deserves attention and care rather than being something we rush into while distracted by screens and worries. The Vikings lived in a harsh world, but they found pockets of warmth and rest within that harshness. They could not control the weather or prevent illness or ensure safety, but they could create rituals and frameworks that helped them face uncertainty with some measure of peace. They could not make their lives easy, but they could make their sleep deep by allowing themselves to fully surrender to exhaustion at the end of demanding days. As you lie here now, listening to these words in the darkness of your own night, perhaps you can take something from their experience. Perhaps you can let go of some unnecessary worry, recognizing, as they did, that excessive anxiety about tomorrow does not actually change tomorrow. Perhaps you can appreciate the warmth and comfort available to you, the security that would have seemed miraculous to them. Perhaps you can allow yourself to be tired, to acknowledge that sleep is not weakness but rather a fundamental human need that deserves to be honored. The longhouses are gone now, collapsed back into the earth centuries ago. The people who slept in them are dust, their voices silent, their stories preserved only in fragments of saga and artifact. But the nights they experienced, cold and smoky, filled with the breathing of family and the distant howl of wind, those nights were real as this night you are experiencing now. They lived, they worried, they hoped, they dreamed, and they slept. And in their sleeping, despite everything that made their lives difficult, they often found a depth of rest that eludes their comfortable descendants. So let yourself rest now, as the Vikings rested. Let the weight of the day settle into your muscles, let your breathing slow and deepen, let the boundaries between waking and sleeping blur and soften. You are safe in this moment, warm enough, sheltered enough, alive enough. The problems of tomorrow will still be there tomorrow, waiting patiently for your attention, unchanged by your nighttime worry. For now, there is only this: the darkness, the comfort of your bed, the quiet moment before consciousness slips away. The Vikings knew something that perhaps we have forgotten: that sleep is a kind of trust, a surrender to forces beyond our control, an acknowledgement that we cannot remain vigilant forever. They trusted the walls of their longhouses, the presence of family, the protection of their gods, and the simple fact that they had survived every night before this one. And in that trust, they found rest deep enough to carry them through whatever the next day would bring. Let their nights guide you now into your own rest. Let the cold and smoke and hardship of their world remind you of how much you have to be grateful for. But also let their deep sleep, born of exhaustion and ritual and acceptance, show you that rest is possible even when life is difficult, that peace can be found even when the world outside is harsh, that the human capacity for adaptation extends even to the darkest hours. The fire burns low now, as it did in countless longhouses across the Viking world. The embers glow soft and red, providing just enough light to see the outline of familiar shapes, just enough warmth to soften the cold's sharp edge. All around, in the darkness, others are sleeping. Those you love, those you know, the vast human family stretching across time and space. You are not alone in the dark. You never were. Sleep now as the Vikings slept. Deeply, completely, trusting in the return of morning. The waves still roll against distant shores. The stars still wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. The world continues its turning, indifferent but not hostile, vast but not empty. And you, small and temporary as you are, still have this gift available to you: the ability to close your eyes, to let go, to rest. The journey through Viking nights is complete, but your own night continues, gentle and dark and full of possibility. Let it take you now wherever it will. Let sleep have its way. The Vikings knew this surrender well, and they wait for you on the other side of waking, in that place where all the sleepers of all the ages rest together in the shared human experience of letting go, of trusting darkness, of finding peace. Good night, traveler. Sleep well. And when morning comes, as it always does, may you wake refreshed and ready, as the Vikings woke, to face another day in this strange and beautiful world we all temporarily inhabit together.